For now, I would like to invite Miss Bianca Albers. Oh, that's you? Okay, very welcome. All the way from Australia. Bianca will give 2 presentations today. For the second one, I'm very curious because you come from Australia, but you lead the European collaborative effort on implementation, but you will explain it later.
I might not explain it and just leave it mysterious.
Okay. There you have the point. But for now, I would like to give you the floor to talk about a number of important issues, and you have entitled your presentation Implementation 2.0. We are all very curious. I have a severe, strict time schedule, so after 10 minutes, I give you the time.
Yep.
And then we have 5 minutes for discussion. So the floor is yours.
Good. Thank you. And thank you to you, thank you to Femke for providing me this opportunity to talk a little bit broadly about the state of implementation science and practice after 2 decades of a high level of production in the field. My name is Bianca Albers. I'm standing here with 2 different hats. I'm from an intermediary organization called the Centre for Evidence and Implementation in Melbourne, in Australia. That sounds highly exotic. I am a European citizen. I have a red passport, born in Germany and a Danish citizen today. And I've kept my linkages with the European implementation world. I'm living in Australia at the moment, but will be back in 2018. So it's a time-limited period my life in Australia implies. So this, and the second head is the European Implementation Collaborative, which I will talk about later today. The Center for Evidence and Implementation is describing itself as an intermediary located somewhere in between policy, practice, and science, and aiming to work towards a greater uptake of evidence in policy and practice. And implementation science and implementation practice has been a focus of our work for quite some time. And I think everybody who has been in the field for a couple of years has experienced this enormous growth of productivity in the field. There were few publications just 15 years ago. There were fewer educational institutions with an interest in implementation. The interest in implementation from government, non-government bodies has grown quite substantially. We have at least one journal, maybe more, focusing on implementation today. So it's been quite impressive to see this area develop. And with that development has come what I would call a conceptual richness. And that conceptual richness is reflected in some of the latest key publications which I have listed here. So you have the publication which Marcia also referred to by Rachel Tabak and her colleagues. They identified 60, and I think it's 61 to be honest, I think there's a mistake on the slide, dissemination and implementation frameworks. The work of Byron J. Powell is worth highlighting here. He spent quite a bit of time together with colleagues on understanding what are specific behavioral implementation strategies that are at the disposal of implementation practitioners. Put his ideas in front of a panel of experts, and they ended up identifying 73 different implementation strategies you potentially could apply in doing your implementation work. There is the work coming out of the Society for Implementation Research Collaboration in Seattle, CIRC. Cara J. Lewis heading a process of identifying measures that can be used to measure the implementation, its different elements. They identified these 420 different measures and spent some time on assessing their validity, reliability, level of evidence, with sometimes disappointing results, but At least there are these potential instruments. And then you have a publication by Krause and colleagues who try to understand what are the barriers, the facilitators that potentially need to be taken into accordance when planning an intervention, an implementation intervention, and identify 601 practice determinants. So it's impressive. It's a large toolbox. And in that sense, a very nice progress made. But while we have this conceptual richness, we might have empirical poverty still. I think there are lots of concepts where we have very little evidence that they really play a role. And I want to give you just 2 examples of such concepts to make that point. And the first concept I want to use is implementation readiness, because it's. I think it has an appeal as an idea that yes, it makes sense that you need to be ready before you can do thorough implementation work. But are we really in a position to answer the question: is readiness a critical precursor to successful implementation? Brian Weiner, who has worked in implementation readiness for quite some time, has done a review of the literature that focuses on 76 different implementation readiness measures. And his answer to that question would be, I don't think we really know what we're talking about. So partly because there is no single study really trying to measure prospectively, does implementation readiness make a difference for an implementation success? The studies you find so far are studies that assess an association between implementation readiness and implementation success based on evidence-based practices that already have been adopted and are implemented. So that makes, based on study design perspective, a difference here. At the same time, he points to quite inconsistent ideas in the literature about what it means to be ready. What does it mean to be ready as an organization, as an individual, as a team that is treated quite differently? There are very few reliable, valid, practical tools to measure readiness. And there's very, very little knowledge about if you're really not ready, what does it take to enhance your readiness, to promote your readiness and get you into another spot? So, conceptual richness, but probably empirical poverty. Not sure, but could be. Implementation leadership, and another example of something that I think appeals to many. It is so easy to say, oh yeah, the support from my leaders has been quite important to my implementation journey. But again, are we sure that the leadership of executives, middle managers, and frontline leaders improve implementation outcomes? Through the implementation outcomes, the service outcomes, and through these outcomes, then the client outcomes. And when I talk about implementation outcomes, I refer to the work of Enola Proctor and colleagues, so talking about the acceptability, the adoption, appropriateness, costs, feasibility, fidelity, penetration, and sustainability of an evidence-based practice. And again, I don't think we can be that sure. At least we don't know for sure. There's a single systematic review produced in 2015 by people at the Linköping University around Per Nilsson, who looked at the relationship between leadership and the implementation of evidence-based practice. We're able to identify 17 different studies that focused on this relationship and point to lack of precise definitions and conceptual inconsistency around our use of the leadership concept. Incomprehensive use of theoretical models underpinning these studies. So when you have a study using transformational leadership as the theoretical model, sometimes they only use a part of it. Methodological flaws, particularly related to the measurement of leadership. And taken all of this together, they point to the need for more theoretical advancement around our use of the leadership concept in implementation science, recommend to refine the terminology and then really make sure that the terminology is used consistently over time. And suffice to say, they also point to the need of doing better studies in this particular area. So these just as two examples where I would say we still need to develop quite substantially in order to be more sure of what works in implementation, what is effective in implementation. There's a third area that puzzles me a bit, but I would probably say I present on it less evidence-based, so it's more a hypothesis. But my impression is, Marsha, no offense, but most of the stuff comes from the US. So theories, models, concepts, many empirical studies come out of the US. The US-based thinking might dominate the field a bit still. And I wonder how the European context might be a particular context to take into accordance. And when I think of the European context, I don't think of Europe as a whole, but more of particular features like the labor market culture and regulations in this country are just different. So they provide a different context for how you can work with staff when they implement evidence-based practice. The educational cultures are different. A social worker coming into a provider agency to be trained up and deliver evidence-based practices comes with a different set of knowledge and understandings. The societal, the basic values in some societies are just different. The drinking cultures or the cultures for sexual behavior are different. The way we treat religion is different. And how does that make Europe just a very different turf to operate on when you implement evidence-based practice? Can we answer that question? Probably not, because there are very few studies helping us to answer that question. And emerging out of that question then is the third one, and I would be happy to discuss that. Does the European cultural, social, and political context form such a distinct implementation setting that a particular European implementation language, science, and practice is required? And I have no clear answer to that. It could be interesting to explore that further in the coming years. So with these thoughts, back to my question, where to next? I think more theoretical thinking and empirical testing is needed. We've spent a lot of time on identifying barriers, facilitators. There are a lot of studies on that, but it's probably no longer sufficient. It could be more important in the coming years to focus very much on studies, clearer questions, clearer designs. I have a colleague in the US who tweeted at the end of last year, there should be a moratorium on implementation frameworks. No more frameworks. We have enough. Improvement of measures. So we just get a 10 to 20 well-validated, reliable measures for different implementation purposes, especially in implementation practice. I think there's a great need in the practice field to support through measurement. And then maybe strengthening the European angle. I find the implemental, how do you say that? Implemental? All right. Trying to build a bridge between the mental and the all. So it's very interesting to see this kicked off now, and I wonder if there are more European implementation projects in the pipeline in the future. Very promising. And with that note, thank you for your attention, and happy to discuss a couple of things for 2 minutes or 5 minutes. See, Ooh.
Thank you for your very inspiring talk and also food